Thank you all for joining us. We're here for part 4 of Italian opera for Yiddish speaking masses in early 20th century America, presented to us by Dr. Daniela Smoilev Levy. We're so excited to have this series continue. We wanted to indicate that in addition to doing each of these talks, Dr. Smoilev Levy has provided summaries of the talks that she's done, which we post to our blog on our website called Conversations. So we're going to drop the links of those first 3 posts of those summaries, so those of you that have been with us or have not been with us have a sense for what wonderful, unique research Dr. Smoilev Levy has provided to us. So once again, let me introduce Dr. Daniela Smoilev Levy, who received her doctorate from Stanford University. She's a very gifted musician as a pianist and has really done a lot of work in scholarship on opera, looking at Jewish engagement in opera, and teaches at the University of Southern California, and is now involved with a postdoctoral fellowship program that focuses on research. It's called the Dybbuk Project, which focuses on the Dybbuk and many other forms of Yiddish theater. And what we've seen in the first few lectures, and I know we'll see again today, is just how unique the resources that Dr. Smoilev Levy is able to find and present to us and stitch together a fascinating history. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Daniela Smoilev Levy. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Mark, for having me. It's wonderful to have had this opportunity to present a multi-part series where we can really dive into so many different aspects of this incredibly rich cultural scene. So I'm very glad to have the chance to do that. So today we have part 4 of the 5-part series, and I will share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint presentation. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Looks good.
Yes, okay, thank you. So today we're looking at part 4, which I've called Bringing Everyone Together, the Zuro Opera Company. So this is the 4th lecture that I've been giving on the topic of Italian and French opera aimed at Yiddish speakers. And the first 2 lectures you can see here, I focused on impresarios. The 3rd lecture, we talked about Medvedev, who was an opera singer. And today we're going to look at figure who was a conductor and music director, so somebody who was intimately involved in the actual production of these popular price opera performances on the Lower East Side and beyond. And so what's interesting about all of these endeavors is the varying degrees to which the downtown spheres melded, interacted with, exchanged ideas with the uptown opera spheres. And I'm calling downtown the Lower East Side setting of New York City, mostly home to Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants, as well as many Italian immigrants. And they were a really known for being a music-loving group, and we'll get to that in a minute. So there were a lot of popular opera enterprises aimed at this audience. So that's the downtown scene. And then the uptown scene is how I'm characterizing the more mainstream opera world, predominantly elite-oriented opera, but also popularly oriented opera in English that was not part of the ethnic immigrant scene, but was more sort of considered mainstream American culture. So what is interesting about this time period, as you can see from the previous lectures, is how much popular price opera there really was going on. And there was so much of it that the eminent New York music critic W.J. Henderson just couldn't get over how much popular price opera there was. And it was cheap opera, dollar opera, opera popular prices are all referring to the same thing, which is just in contrast to elite-oriented opera. And Henderson kept looking around him in 1908, in 1909, in 1915, and there are probably more articles that I just haven't found, where he just can't get over his surprise as to why these popular price opera impresarios just seem not to be getting the memo that the public, as Henderson saw it, just didn't want cheap opera because these enterprises kept failing. He referred to them as, he sort of lists all the various impresarios that he knows of, and noted that they had all, quote, died for lack of patronage, and described the whole popular price opera scene as an exercise in faith, hope, and charity. So he kept trying to figure out why these impresarios kept trying to bring popular price opera to the Yiddish-speaking masses if it was likely to fail. In his view, the main reason people went to the opera was to see the big name stars, which you could really only see at places like the Metropolitan Opera or the Manhattan, or if you were in other cities, or Chicago Opera. In Boston, you could sometimes see really big name people, but obviously for most of cheap opera, they were not especially big name people. And yet the public kept coming. So this sort of creates kind of a puzzle. And some answers we might pose, or we might suggest to Henderson would be that clearly the ethnic immigrant audiences still had a lot of interest in these things. They brought a tradition of opera going, especially among Italians from Europe. There was a broader trend in progressive era in the belief that things like opera and symphonic music and other forms of quote unquote high culture had the potential to uplift the public, to offer a kind of enlightenment or refinement. And so by attending these kinds of performances, really any kind of performances of opera that exposed people to this high culture was an opportunity for them to better themselves. And so that was an appealing kind of rhetoric at the time. And also the fact that, as we'll see, discussed in the past, there was a lot of overlap between the uptown and downtown spheres. There was a lot of elite-oriented opera personnel who did participate in the cheap opera. And so while the quality was sometimes uneven, you really could have sometimes some really excellent singers performing. So, the audiences were often getting quite good value for their money, which might have been another reason for its appeal. It's also possible that some of these impresarios were kind of idealistic. Or maybe they were just unperturbed by the idea that, as they probably all very well knew, that these enterprises were often quite short-lived. I mean, they could see them as kind of seasonal enterprises, the way Halloween companies pop up just for Halloween and then fade away, and then they come back again when it's time for the next season. And really, how many times can you see Carmen in a single season, fun though it is? So maybe just they recognize that this public just needed time to regain its operatic appetites, and so we're content to disappear and then try again in some other form later. In any case, whatever the actual reason or main reason, the Lower East Side, as I mentioned before, was a place viewed by many impresarios as a good place for popular price opera companies to try their hand. You can see here an ad, is a typical ad from Die Wahrheit, a Yiddish newspaper, for phonographs. Any kind of phonograph you could possibly want, you can buy it all at once, you can pay in installments. Lots of phonographs, lots of music going on here too. It's just one of many, many ads for pianos, every price point, every kind, all upright pianos, player pianos, whatever you want. So this is a place where there's lots of music of lots of different kinds, including opera. And so this is an ad for the Zero Opera Company, which was just one of many such companies at the time, run by the father-son duo of Louis Zero, who was the impresario, and his son Josiah, who was the music director and conductor. They were immigrants from Bialystok, which at the time was the Russian Empire. They came over in 1906 when Josiah was just 18 years old. He'd studied in conservatories in Odessa and Krakow. He just graduated. And so he and his father began in 1911 this enterprise in Lower East Side theaters, offering, as you can see here, is a pretty representative list of popular price Italian, French, and German opera, also some German. And they did this every spring between 1911 and 1915. So just to confuse Henderson even more, they weren't alone. There was just even more. There's an example here of Antonio Ferrara, whom we met in the first lecture on Abramson, who was already doing his popular price opera aimed at Italian immigrants. And the New York Tribune, which reported plenty on these cheap opera enterprises, described him as an Italian Oscar Hammerstein who gives grand opera because he likes to, between whiles, standing behind a counter and selling cakes and sweetmeats to get the money to pay his tenors and sopranos. And Ferrara is quoted as saying, "I have lost much money, but I love art. What I lose, I make here in my cafe. I make big business now." And you can see here that little ad that's for his company, for his pastry shop, which is still in operation on the Lower East Side, in the original address, I believe, too. So this is very similar kind of thing to what the Zeros were doing, but as we'll see, also had its differences. So as I said, maybe it makes more sense, more productive to just take it as a given that there's interest. And instead of asking why the Zeros established their company, might be more productive to think about how it fit into the history of these kinds of enterprises in order to understand better the evolution of Lower East Side opera culture of the period. And so as we'll see throughout the lecture, although the Zuro organization was typical in many ways of popular price opera companies of the period, the kind of uptown influence and high-toned rhetoric surrounding it in both the English language and the Yiddish language press reveals a kind of shifting relationship between immigrant-oriented Lower East Side opera culture and the broader opera sphere. And in particular, it reveals a kind of growing blend that had certainly begun in prior years, but that was particularly salient in the example of the Zuros as a kind of link between what became known as a very clearly Lower East Side institution and the broader American sphere of opera and high culture as Josiah Zuro continued on in his career. So we will look first at similarities between and differences between Zuro and Abramson's company from 1907, 1909, and then Hammerstein's Manhattan Opera. And then we'll look at how the Zuros are unique and how they represent this broader trend of integration and assimilation. So we'll start here by looking at Zuros and Abramson. The performance style was really quite similar from anything we can tell. We have to rely mostly on reviews from the English language press, which was, as I said, a frequent reviewer, a frequent source of reviews for popular price companies of all these types. The Yiddish press, which mostly posted or published articles that were summaries of what the repertoire was and who was singing and sort of the background of the musicians and of the impresario and his son, the conductor. There were very, very few reviews, but they do have some, but they're clearly very invested in the success of the enterprise. So this mostly just full of praise. So they're not that useful in ascertaining what the performances actually were like. The English language press is more comfortable in criticizing. And so you see this very same kind of critiques for the Abramson company as for the Zuros. They're essentially very solid, enthusiastic, passionate, often very youthful, a little too youthful, too passionate, too loud sometimes performances. But because there were sometimes some, as I mentioned earlier, some people with considerable experience in prestigious opera houses, there were some moments of really high artistic attainment. So sometimes I've noticed that when I'm reading reviews for the Zuros and Abramson, sometimes I wonder if I'm getting confused because some of the reviews are really quite interchangeable. And actually, another connection that I discovered was that Josiah Zuro had actually conducted with Abramson's company in 1907. So he had direct experience and maybe drew on some of that when he was doing his own conducting for the company that he and his father were running. Similarities too we see in singers and musicians, a lot of young singers, which makes sense because they could probably get them for pretty low rates, but if you found talented people, you could put together a good performance, as well as more experienced people and some orchestra members also from places like the Metropolitan Opera in Manhattan. Well, the Manhattan had already ended by that point, but performers who had been in these elite-oriented houses. Actually, there were a few singers who performed in both the Zuro company and Abramson's, including Louis Samoilov, whom we met briefly in the lecture about Abramson, and also an Italian named Cesare Alessandroni, whom we'll hear now in an excerpt from Otello, Verdi's Otello.
originario in me. mio destino denetio. Credo che il giusto ha un istrion beffardo nel viso e nel cuor, che tutto è lui bugiardo, lagrima, bacio, sguardo, sacrificio e onor. E credo all'uomo io ho diritto a parte alle germe della colla. Al derrame della valle. Viene dopo tanta irrisión la morte. E poi la morte è il nulla e vecchia sola è il
Kind of hard to believe that that was already 110 years ago. It's amazing that we have these recordings. And as you can see, this one was from 1912, which would have been right around the time that Alessandroni would have been performing with the Zuro Company. And they performed actually this opera as well. So probably pretty representative of what it would have sounded like at the time for audiences. And Otello is a particularly good opera, probably for the Lower East Side, because there were quite a number of performances of Yiddish versions of it in the theater as well. So audiences were familiar with the story and so had the opportunity to hear the opera as well, which probably helped in drawing especially new audiences. We'll get to that in a minute. So another similarity between the Zuro Company and Abramson and others of their ilk is the timing of their seasons. It was no accident that they typically performed in the spring, the late spring, early summer, when the Met had already ended its season, so minimizing competition. This was also after the time that the Yiddish theaters were mostly closed or starting to close for the summer. And because the Zuro Company is often mentioned in the Yiddish papers in the context of the Yiddish theater in the same articles, suggestive of the fact that, and also the fact that they were, avoiding competition suggests that there was a lot of overlap between those sets of audiences. In venue too, there were similarities. They typically performed on the Lower East Side, aiming when they were performed there at Jewish immigrant and Italian audiences, although reviews in, again, both the Yiddish and the English language press suggest that people did come from uptown as well to the Lower East Side, mostly the People's Theater, the Italia, and the Grand. But like Abramson, who performed in the American theater when in New York, and also in various mainstream theaters when the company went on tour, the Zuros performed a few times in Daly's Theater, which was considered an uptown theater on 29th Street, and also a few times in Spooner's Theater, which was in the Bronx, in what was at the time an immigrant neighborhood. But in Daly's, that was, like the American, is more typical for middle-class audiences or Anglo-American publics to attend. So drew a more diverse set of listeners there. And of course, no popular price company would be popular price without its low prices. And what's significant is not just the low prices, which was typically from 25 cents to $1 or $1.50, but the fact that no matter what the theater, even when they performed in the uptown theaters and were drawing a more somewhat of a more affluent clientele, they kept the same low prices because they knew that there were people from downtown who were still coming uptown. So they wanted to make sure to keep it affordable. And especially for the Zuro company, the Yiddish press referred many times to the cheap prices, how affordable it was, how these performances were giving the Yiddish-speaking masses the opportunity to hear these great works of art at such low prices. It's clearly a major selling point. There's even an ad in 1915 in the Jewish Morning Journal, a reference to, and they were talking about the company, and there was a performance, some special matinees that the Zuros were offering that went as low as 15 cents. And so that prompted the newspaper to remark that, quote, the poorest music lovers will thereby also have a chance to hear opera. So that's really pretty low. And I mean, 15 cents, even by Yiddish theater standards, is really pretty cheap. And you can see here a typical ad from 1914 for the company. And you can see the emphasis on the prices. Sometimes if you look at ads, even in the Yiddish papers for Manhattan Opera, for example, you can't even find the price list, or it's very small. So clearly they're just trying not to think about that too much, but here this is front and center. Another set of similarities we can see between the companies is the presence of Jewish elements, which is which are facts that are highlighted in the Yiddish press frequently, but hardly ever mentioned in the English language press, which viewed the Zuros and Abramson's company and others of its type as just as secular organizations. I mean, they mentioned the Lower East Side and the immigrant audiences, but they didn't really emphasize any kind of Jewish elements in the subject of operas or the composers or the presence of Jewish singers, which were made headlines sometimes in the Yiddish press. For the Zuros, they were known for doing La Juive, which other companies aiming at Jewish audiences often did. The Zuros also did Les Huguenots, which was not done that often, Lower East Side, and of course also Samson and Delilah because of the biblical subject. And they mentioned the presence of Jewish singers in their companies like Samuilov. And the Zuros were also known in particular for having promoted a young singer at the time with not a whole lot of performance experience, but who had connections to the Lower East Side. And this was Janet Barondes, who was the daughter of the influential Lower East Side political figure, Joseph Barondes, who was prominent in politics and labor unions and involved also with the Board of Education. So she was performing in several different roles in 1914, which made headlines not only in the Yiddish press, actually this is one exception where the English language press did report on the presence of specifically Jewish singers, and they mentioned that she was performing in these operas. And that made headlines in the New York Times. And in 1915, the Zuros actually managed to put together an all-Jewish cast for Aida, where all the main roles were sung by Jews, some of whom were of Italian descent. But yeah, that was a big deal. And they did it for Aida, which was probably also not an accident. Aida is an opera that we see very frequently done on the Lower East Side. Despite the grandness of its setting, you might think that something like Aida would not be the best thing to do when you have limited forces, because of, you need the big grand setting, the Egyptian temple, horses, elephants you might want for the grand scenes. But I guess that didn't deter them, because they often opened their seasons with Aida. And the music critic William Edlin, who was a journalist for the Yiddish press for many years and wrote books on opera aimed at Yiddish speakers, he mentioned specifically that Aida had special appeal for Jewish speakers, for Yiddish speakers, for Jews more generally, because of what he called the Oriental melodies that presumably had some kind of Jewish feel to them that made Jewish audiences like Aida especially. And Aida, as you might guess, was one of just the many standard popular Italian and French operas that these companies did, as well as a few novelties. For example, the Zuros did The Tales of Hoffmann, which was the first performance of that opera on the Lower East Side, at least in recent memory. They also did some rarely performed Verdi operas like Hernani, as well as La Forza del Destino and Un ballo in maschera, which weren't done all that frequently. You can see here the full list of operas that they did in their Lower East Side, their 1911, 1915 seasons, mostly on the Lower East Side, but as we talked about, also a little farther uptown. La Juive, interestingly, as you can see, was given in Italian as Lebrea. Again, probably just a response to the particular forces that they had on hand, which singers would have been able to sing in which language. So I guess they had a lot of Italians on hand at the time, which was, as you might expect, the most the biggest ethnic group making up opera singers in these circles at the time. Although there certainly were plenty of Americans as well. All right, so now I'd like to move to comparing the Zuros to Hammerstein, who was a real giant of the mainstream opera scene. And we met Oscar Hammerstein the first in our second lecture as a figure who had a real commitment, lifelong commitment to democratizing opera, making it available to the mass public. But he, ironically enough, made his biggest splash doing elite-oriented opera in his Manhattan Opera Company that became a competitor to the Met. And he was so successful and there was so much competition that ultimately the Met bought him out in 1910 to get rid of him as competition. So the rule was that from 1910 to 1920, well, Hammerstein died in 1919, but for 10 years, the agreement was that he wasn't going to be able to produce any opera in New York. So in 1911, when the Zuros are starting up, he's not there anymore. But even though he's not giving opera, his presence looms large, both in the Lower East Side Yiddish speaking sphere, as well as in the eyes of the metropolitan. We'll get to that in a little bit. And of course, Hammerstein had his educational, quote unquote, educational opera season, where he tried to draw even more Lower East Side musicians or Lower East Side audiences to his uptown performances and try to make them accessible. So he wasn't performing, but he was sort of blended into the conception of the Zuros because both Louis Zuro and Josiah Zuro had begun their American operatic involvement with Hammerstein. Louis Zuro had been stage manager, and Josiah Zuro started out as assistant chorus master, where he was making $10 a week, which was at that point even a very, very, very little amount of money. But he had to work his way up to be assistant conductor, and this was back in 1906. I mean, they immigrated sometime in 1906, and by the fall they were already with Hammerstein, so they really kind of got right off the boat and right to opera. So Hammerstein really gave them their start, especially Josiah Zuro, who got a lot of conducting experience with Hammerstein. And the Yiddish press very often referred to Josiah Zuro's in particular experience with Hammerstein as a real selling point for the company, as assurance of its high quality because of its association with the elite opera world, even though the Zuros themselves were viewed as real sort of Lower East Side figures who had had some involvement with the uptown opera scene. And actually, when Hammerstein left the opera scene in New York in 1910, Zuro had the understanding with him that if Hammerstein did in fact come back to do more opera, that he would continue to work with him. So the real sort of ongoing relationship. And so more than just high quality, the Yiddish press characterized the Zuro endeavor as, especially Josiah Zuro's conducting, as a kind of serious engagement with the music. It described him as somebody with really serious artistic intentions with lofty goals, who's as a conductor who didn't give in to the temptation that other conductors might have in his position to cheap or splashy effects just to make things exciting. But he really stayed, according to the press anyway, true to the spirit of the composer and tried to keep things really musically, artistically authentic. In other words, he wasn't really, they saw him as not pandering to the public, as one of the reviews from 1911 put it in an article entitled Opera for Connoisseurs and Beginners. In short, the performances at the People's Theater are worthy of the support of all lovers of opera. The idea being that even if you knew and loved opera, you weren't going to be disappointed if you came to these performances. But as the title of that article, as I just mentioned, suggests, the Zuro company was seen also as catering to audiences who were new to opera, and they were frequently referred to in the context of rhetoric of education or uplift, very much like Hammerstein as well. And the idea was that Zuros were offering mass audiences an opportunity to be exposed to these works of art, which they weren't, many of whom weren't that familiar with, And this article, the Opera for Connoisseurs and Beginners, notes that there was there was a real interest in figuring out, what the best opera was to see. The author writes, quote, "What opera should I go see? This is a question that one now hears often in the Jewish neighborhood, where there are so many tens of thousands of men and women who have never yet been in an opera house and do not know how an opera differs from a regular theater performance." So the low prices were a real entry point for people to have a chance to learn about opera in this context. And in case you're curious, the opera that they recommend people start with who don't know much about opera is Carmen, which is probably a good suggestion. Still another way in which the Zuros drew on Hammerstein's kind of uptown feel was in the element of philanthropy, although they no doubt were trying to survive financially. At least rhetorically, they said they were not concerned if they didn't make a profit. The point was they were just trying to put out good art for the public, make it accessible. Louis Zuro told a reporter in 1911, quote, that he is satisfied with his season. If he perhaps doesn't make any profit, he says, it also doesn't concern him. And of course, the idea of giving opera for the love of it is something we saw in that article about Ferrara from 1912, who's committed this idealistic way to promoting the cause of art among the public. The Zuros also drew on the Hammerstein pedigree, you could say, by having some Manhattan opera singers or former Manhattan opera singers perform with them as well, such as the mezzo-soprano Alice Gentle, whom we'll hear in an excerpt here from a film from 1930 called Golden Dawn. The song is called When You're Young, and a funny little quirk of fate is that this movie was based on a musical of the same name with book and lyrics by Otto Harbach and Oscar Hammerstein II, Oscar Hammerstein I's grandson. So there's yet another connection there they couldn't have foreseen. So we'll listen to it right now. So the Zuros, as we've seen, have been drawing in their seasons on the influences both from downtown, from the Abramson style company, and uptown from Hammerstein's style of company. But they also have some unique elements that make them stand out in this broader context of popular price opera companies at the time. And one in particular is that they were viewed in the Yiddish press, in particular, as a distinctively Jewish institution. Even by their second or third season, the press, I should say, was commenting on them as a kind of a regular, established presence on the Lower East Side theatrical scene, something that everybody expected and was excited to have back again, reported on how they were going to Europe to bring these singers and that singers and who was arriving and who was staying and coming and going. So a lot of notices in the press, and Die Wahrheit in particular, which was a Yiddish newspaper that was kind of arts and culture focused. There's some periods during the height of the Zuro seasons where there's some reference to the Zuros in every day in the newspaper. So they're really all over the Yiddish press. And already, as we can see from the first season, they were seen in Yiddish speaking circles as a kind of Lower East Side phenomenon, the humorous Yiddish magazine Der Kibitzer commented after the Zuros moved in the middle of their first season, actually uptown to daily theater, to the mainstream theater. They observed that, quote, the Goyim, that is the non-Jews, have a tendency to kidnap good things from us. So revealing kind of sense of Jewish ownership of the enterprise. So the rhetoric of kidnapping is something we see quite a lot in operatic affairs too. Sometimes in the reporting on Hammerstein, the Yiddish papers would talk about how Hammerstein's company had stolen or kidnapped singers from this opera company, that opera company. So kind of forcible taking. So we see that in this context as well. And a similar kidnapping happened that reveals the kind of specifically Lower East Side focus of the Zuro enterprise, was the hiring of Josiah Zuro to conduct for the Popular Price Century Opera, which was an offshoot of the Metropolitan Opera that they began that they started organizing in 1913, but started performances in 1914 as a way, actually, which wasn't known at the time, but not known publicly, but the Century Opera stemmed from the Metropolitan's concern that Oscar Hammerstein might try to stage a comeback by getting around the agreement not to perform opera in New York. They were worried that he might make the claim that since the Met didn't do Popular Price Opera, that he wasn't in direct competition with them if he came back and did Popular Price Opera. So in order to forestall that, the Met decided to organize their own Popular Price Opera, and I guess they thought that Josiah Zuro was going to be a good person to hire. In fact, there's a newspaper article that describes how some prominent figures from the Met came to a Zuro Carmen performance on the Lower East Side. And there was much to do about the fact that in the boxes, you could see these really important people, to the point that the reviewer noted that you looked in the box seats of the people sitter, you might think for a moment you were actually yourself at the Metropolitan Opera. And actually Hammerstein came to a performance of the Zuro company also in 1914. He must have come to town. He'd been in London. He might have come just to get a feel for what was going on, see if there were any openings for him to try again with opera. But in any case, Zuro definitely, he did go to work for the Century Opera, just the first among the early forays that he was making outside of the Lower East Side, where he had really established his reputation. And actually, he also conducted a few times on Broadway and some operettas and musicals as well. So again, representative of this trend, as I'm suggesting, of this increasing blending of the Lower East Side cultural sphere with the American mainstream. So Josiah Zuro is a kind of link between the Lower East Side sphere and the more uptown or mainstream opera world. And in fact, as we've seen, there were instances of this earlier on in Abramson, certainly, but you can see as the beginning of this trend, and that he did perform occasionally in some mainstream theaters in New York, and also, as we mentioned, on tour. But his company lasted only a few years, less time certainly than the Zuros, and he didn't have any further operatic involvement. He did some little bunch of other things in Yiddish theater, and he went on to film, but he didn't do any more opera. And also, he was different in that his company was much less ideologically oriented, at least publicly, about uplift or education. At least in his very early promotion, Abramson frequently referred to the fact that he was in it for business, that there was demand, there were Italians and Jews who wanted Popular Price Opera, and so by golly, he was going to give it to them, and he's happy to take their money, kind of how he put it. Although in his memoirs, he has more, maybe with the passing of time, a more kind of idealistic tone to it. But in any case, the Zuros were seen much more as incorporating this more uptown or mainstream ideology of uplift that a company like Abramson's hadn't really been known for. And the Yiddish theater scene too, in the years prior to the Zuros, we see some Yiddish theater actors like Bertha Kalish and Jacob Adler actually having some performances in English on Broadway. So this is the beginnings of this gradual integration of Lower East Side performers and performance style, and some broader just cultural tendencies into this mainstream opera world. At the same time, the Lower East Side was incorporating influences from the more mainstream opera world into its performances and in the way that it was presenting itself as a cultural institution. And as I mentioned, so Josiah Zuro himself was a real link as an immigrant himself between the immigrant scene and bringing this kind of uptown opera pedigree to this Lower East Side, and then beginning sort of spreading it back out into the more mainstream opera world. And in fact, after the Zuro Opera Company had its last season in 1915, they actually did a follow-up fall season to their usual spring season. After that, he continued on to a pretty influential career as an opera democratizer and as a classical music in general democratizer. Gained a real reputation in the mainstream opera world as someone who sought to expose the mass public, especially young people, to high culture, as well as committed to giving young musicians a chance to get some performance experience. And you can see here some of the things he did. Starting in 1916, he conducted opera in baseball stadiums. He did at Ebbets Field, Brooklyn. He also conducted in San Francisco. In 1920, he established with his violinist friend of the Manhattan Opera, they established what they called the New School of Opera and Ensemble to train young singers. Zuro conducted for other popular price opera companies in New York and Brooklyn, in San Francisco as well. He actually also conducted for the San Carlo Company, which went on to have an extensive, very long-lived, actually, unusually long-lived for popular price opera touring presence in the United States. He promoted opera in public schools at what he called motion picture prices. And of course, in 1915, this was the beginnings of the increased dissemination of film, which was a major source of competition, certainly for live theater. And tickets were even cheaper for motion pictures, film, movies at the time than live theater was. So the fact that he was offering some form of opera, even if maybe a more reduced scale kind of performances, that he was making them accessible at these very low prices. He was also well known for having established in 1924 what was known as the Sunday Symphony Society, which gave free or very low price concerts of symphonic music to the general public, and often in conjunction with other religious rhetoric. They sometimes had speakers to impart a kind of religiosity or at least spiritual seriousness to the music and to the whole artistic nature of the endeavor. He also was involved in opera on the radio and had quite an extensive film career as a film composer. As you can see, he was involved in no fewer than 43 films as musical director and conductor. He moved to Hollywood at this point. He composed stock music for 4 films and was the composer for 8. And in fact, in 1929, he was just beginning a very large-scale opera film project with the Pathé Company. They'd planned to do 7 grand opera films, was what film operas they called them. They were going to do Pagliacci, Cavalleria Rusticana, Faust, Martha, Tales of Hoffmann, Carmen, and Aida, and they also had plans in the works for a Wagner cycle as well. But Zuro actually died in a car accident in La Jolla in 1930 at the age of 41. So the opera film project didn't quite get off the ground with him involved. But it's significant that these kind of things were in the works and he was involved in them. So as we've seen through all these different innovative strategies, Zuro's really notable for having brought together diverse audiences for opera. He started not just with, gathering people on the Lower East Side to opera, but also expanded far beyond that to bring as many people into the fold. And in an interview from 1922, as you can see here, he articulated his quite serious view of what democratizing classical music meant for him. As he put it, music, in quote, its serious aspects, it is something besides entertainment. Do you think you can popularize it? No, never. Sort of a funny thing you might think to hear from a popularizer. But in any case, he goes on to say that when music is brought down, as we sometimes say to the people, it has lost, I believe, its mission. Music, to my mind, must always remain on the highest pinnacle. Our duty as artists is to keep it there, to encourage the people to rise to it. So clearly a literally uplifting rhetoric here that we see also actually in the English language press coverage of the company. In 1913, for example, the New York Tribune referred to opera on the Bowery as opera for the people. And they say, quote, it is just the sort of opera that our operatic uplifters have been preaching the last 5 years. And the same article refers to Hammerstein, noting that Josiah Zuro, quote, infused a spirit into all concerned that brought remembrance to those carefree days in the early consulate of Oscar Hammerstein. So in some ways, we can see the Zuro as a sort of unofficial downtown extension of Hammerstein's opera endeavors and his ideology, while also drawing, as we've seen, on the more general, typical structure and feel of the downtown popular enterprises as well. So Zuro's life as a whole can be actually seen as a kind of characteristically American story. Someone with immigrant beginnings who worked his way up to a lot of individual initiative, tried so many different kinds of projects, and someone who started working out largely, or made his reputation anyway, in the immigrant scene, but came to be integrated into the wider operatic world. And while there certainly had been, lots of people involved in Lower East Side theatrical culture for a number of decades, many of them prior to his generation were people who kind of started and ended on the Lower East Side. But as we see, increasingly people who began on the Lower East Side end up moving beyond that and to spread their skills and their cultural understandings into a more mainstream sphere. And so we can see how the beginnings of what we think of as a distinctively American musical theatrical culture, in the form of the Broadway musical especially, had a lot of its roots in the musical theatrical performance practice of the Lower East Side. So the Zuros are a classic example of this early trend in cultural directions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We look forward to people asking any questions that they might have, and we feel please feel free to raise your hand for us to recognize you, or type it in chat, and we'd love to hear from you. I'll start off with a couple of questions maybe while people are pondering. One is that I wonder, in your experience, I don't know if you've compared America to other countries like in Europe, if popularizing of opera works differently in Europe than it does, in America, and if there were precedents for it, at least in America.
Yeah, that's certainly an important context to consider, and something I've looked at some. It's interesting that for many years, starting, I'd say, probably in the, really in the mid 19th century, and especially into the late 19th century, the popularizers of opera in the United States looked to Europe as an example of how they should create a more engaged, civic-oriented opera-going culture among the general public. They talk about doing opera in the vernacular, which was the custom in Europe at the time. So if you were in Italy and you went to see a Wagner opera, which did happen sometimes, you would hear it in Italian. Or if you were in Germany, you went to hear Verdi, you would hear Verdi sung in German. So it's much easier for audiences to enjoy their opera. They were used to enjoying their operas in their their own language, in the language of the audience. And so that was a real point that many democratizers in the United States tried to draw on for the English language justification. But even among the foreign language offerings, there was certainly the ideal that the notion that they were imitating a more established tradition of opera going in Europe, which varied, of course, from country to country. In Italy, certainly it was a much more widespread form of entertainment than you might think. It was, opera was really quite popular. That article I showed about Ferrara is one of many such articles where they talk about how you wouldn't know that Tony, who blacks your boots every morning, knows Donizetti inside out. So this is a kind of integral part of the opera going culture. Maybe somewhat idealized, but it's certainly not everybody. But that was the stereotype anyway, among many immigrants. So I would say that there was already there was a kind of a distinctive tradition in Europe that had been more established of a kind of middle class or even working class engagement with opera that was seen as a model for America to draw on.
Yeah, I wonder if the singing waiter is a part of that.
Yeah, it could be.
A part of that era. So Zachary Baker, thanks for being here, Zachary. has a wonderful question. If you'd like to ask it, Zachary, please do.
Yeah. So the Zuros immigrated in 1906, did you say?
Mm-hmm.
So Josiah would have been a teenager then.
Yeah, he was 18.
My question is, what kind of musical training did he receive either in Europe or America? And also, what type of career did his father pursue before he came to America?
So as far as I can tell, Josiah Zuro, he was trained at the conservatories in Odessa and Krakow. So these were traditional music schools. He probably had the standard, composition. I think he was a pianist that was his instrument, and probably did, conducting, and I'm just surmising here, but, probably basic composition, that kind of thing. So it was a pretty traditional classical music. I'm not exactly sure what his father's profession was. I mean, it seems that some newspapers refer to him as having had some stage manager experience, not clear. With Hammerstein when they came to America. I'm not sure what his credentials were in that respect, but he seems to have mainly figured in the Zuro company as a kind of organizer and promoter. So I'm not sure where he brought his skills from for that, but he didn't do much, as far as I know, anything more with opera after this.
They really landed on their feet pretty quickly, though, after arriving.
Yeah, for sure. And Josiah Zuro was seen as a kind of wunderkind, would probably be too strong a term, but as a real, young, successful, very talented musician who rose quickly and got a lot of acclaim even from a very young age. I think he was known as the youngest, assistant chorus master probably that the opera had ever had, although who knows. But
thank you.
Sure, thanks.
So another question I had was, I was really I was really struck by the comment that was made that they're saying that the non-Jewish world is kidnapping things from us. Where do you know the Yiddish phrase "Wie es kristelt sich, Yiddel sich"? That was it was something that I had always heard, particularly on things I did in the Orthodox community, where it was basically just as the non-Jews do, then the Jews do. So it's kind of like we're always borrowing from them. If they have something that's good, that we'll take it. But it just seems to me to be rare culturally, at least from what I've experienced, that it's that there's that's kind of part of like a New York cultural component.
Yeah, and that stood out to me in the research I've been doing in the Yiddish press and all these companies, is that the Zuro is more than the other companies of the period that were aimed at Yiddish-speaking immigrants. They were really seen as kind of established in the Lower East Side as representing that culture, even though obviously the opera they were doing was borrowed, and the whole notion of uplift and in the Jewish circles stemmed from the earlier Haskalah Enlightenment movement in Europe that sought to bring the best of world culture to Yiddish speakers, making it accessible. There's a real movement in the late 19th, early 20th century to do that, not just in music, but maybe even especially in literature, translating the greats of European classics, and as well as promoting new writers in Yiddish or new authors and new literature that was meant to be kind of high toned and serious, to kind of encourage this authentic or Yiddish speaking cultural engagement with this broader cultural sphere. But it is funny, as you suggest, as you're observing, that they were then seen as having incorporated that and then taken it, or seen as having been taken elsewhere. So it's just it struck me that this Jewish element was seen as a kind of important part of the company's identity, even as it was drawing on the wider cultural background.
And in your experience, have you found, is it common that there would be other companies that would appeal to other ethnic groups, or advertisements in newspapers and other languages? I mean, obviously Italian opera is in Italian, so the Italian speaking community is getting a huge audience.
For sure. I mean, there were definitely lots of overlaps between the audiences for the opera, on these popular price enterprises, regardless of who was giving it. So in the Ferrara, Farrar was giving his opera, there were lots of Jews who came. There are people of other ethnic backgrounds. There's an article, I think, in Magazine from 1907 that talks about all the different ethnicities that come. We see ads in Yiddish for Italian companies run by Italians, aimed mostly at Italian immigrants, but obviously we're trying to get Jews as well. In the theater as well, we see ads for Italian productions in the Yiddish papers. The companies shared theaters as well. The People's Theater was used for performances by Italian companies as well as Yiddish-speaking ones. Sometimes actors, according to one scholar, anyway, would sometimes share costumes and sets. So there was definitely overlap, and you see ads for Italian companies, not just opera, in the Yiddish press as well. So there was certainly overlap. And I believe I saw when I was looking at Medvedev, the Russian opera singer who performed in both Yiddish theater and opera on the Lower East Side in the years right around 1900, I found an ad for his performances in Philadelphia in a German newspaper. So there was overlap there too, and I suspect there is more that I just haven't found yet. But there's definitely cross-ethnic interest in sharing and cross-linguistic promotion for sure.
Wonderful. So if anyone has another comment or question, we're happy to hear from you. In the meantime, do you want to tell us what will be in the fifth and final program?
Sure. The last lecture I conceive of as a kind of a bringing together of all these different popular price endeavors aimed at Yiddish speakers, and done some comparison along the way. But I think it's going to be interesting to think about how this development in these specifically Lower East Side companies fits into the broader sphere of the evolution of popularly oriented opera in America more generally. There was a whole world of English language popular price opera that I alluded to earlier, most saliently in the form of Henry Savage, who had a very unusually long-lasting popular opera organization that did not only traditional European opera, Carmen, Aida, Faust, etc., but also did a lot of light opera, comic opera that was contemporary, as well as some of the earlier popular pieces from earlier in the 19th century. So thinking about, there are also other companies. There's the Theodore Drury Opera Company, which is an all-Black company, which advertised in the Yiddish press. There are the Aborn brothers, who were also kind of like Savage, but giving popularly oriented English language opera as well as comic opera. And they were actually at the head of the Century Opera. So we'll look at all these overlapping cultural spheres to try to get a sense of where opera is going and where Yiddish speakers fit into this development at the time.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we said earlier, there are these synopses of each lecture that Dr. Smailovic is providing, which we gave the links in our chat, which you can find on our website. And we also invite you to come back to us to see the last and final lecture. And people can also see the lectures on our YouTube channel. That would be on YouTube, just searching for Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. So thank you very much. We also invite everyone to attend some of our other events and to see our offerings on our website. And thank you all very much, and have a very good evening.
Thanks for having me, Mark.